Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome back, everyone. And next you're going to hear from Charlotte Angus and Heather McPherson. They are with the NDP party, and they're going to be talking about climate action, jobs plan, and should Canada be boycotting the Beijing Olympics. Let's talk about China and the Olympics, because there's a lot to be said here, because China has been accused of genocide in certain regions of their country, because, simply put, these people are Muslim, and they follow the Muslim faith, and China doesn't like that. And more or less, you're going to hear this from one of our speakers today, talking about how they are actually banned from China because they took a stance against what is deemed to be genocide of a group of people. China has isolated them. They have cut all supplies, and they have basically left this country as this part of their country as a regional prison. That they can't travel outside of it, so they can't leave China. They can't travel into other parts of China because they are said to seem to be residents of this region, and they can't communicate outside of China all at the same time. And China is cutting them off, and the reason why it's essentially called genocide is because by cutting them off, they're just waiting for them to die out. And that does break some of the rules of how we're supposed to treat our citizens and how we're supposed to treat people around the world. So it becomes problematic when we hear that they have an Olympics, because in order to get the Olympics to be in your country, you should be treating your citizens on an equal basis. So let's listen to what Charlotte Angus and Heather McPherson actually have to say.
For the Algonquin Nation. And before we begin, as New Democrats, we want to think of the women murdered at École Polytechnique, their families, the sacrifice, and the commitment that we need to make as Canadians to make sure that this kind of horrific violence against women and girls will never, ever be perpetrated again. So Prime Minister Trudeau goes to COP26 and makes a series of dramatic announcements to increase the targets that Canada had promised at Paris. But what he didn't tell the world is that the government has failed to meet any of the previous promises that he has made. In fact, the Environment Commissioner clearly wasn't buying the COP26 sales pitch, because he blasted the Liberals for going from, quote, failure to failure in missing key climate change targets. The Liberals don't seem to understand that unless there is a clear financial commitment that includes workers and their families, Canada will continue to fail on the climate front. Concrete commitments to workers through investments in new clean energy and infrastructure projects will be key to meeting our targets. And it is even more essential for the government to utilize the skills of Canadian energy workers in order to build trust in this so-called...
If you have more than $10,000 in the bank and you don't know this, I can promise you that you're missing out on the opportunity of life.
Just for those of us who have clean energy that is tied to what Joe Biden calls good paying union jobs. We have had no such language from the Prime Minister. What we did get were promises backed by a record of failure. For example, Mr. Trudeau at COP26 promised to decrease methane emissions by 75%, and yet his government isn't close to meeting their previous target of 45%. And what makes this so unacceptable is that the technology is available to drop methane emissions to near zero. The only thing we're missing right now, it appears, is political spine. Mr. Trudeau at COP26 promised an emissions cap on greenhouse gas emissions. So where is that cap?
Yeah, we have about a category, I would say,
of
12,000 or so documents that deal with roughly 8 school narratives from 2.
Despite
there are 4 orders of the Catholic Church that this government did not have the permission.
Resource Minister Wilkinson told the House that Canada's environment record was the envy of the G7. This is simply not true.
Dealing mostly
made
with
his
schools
promises at Canada,
on the West Coast.
The Environment Commissioner, Canada has become the
that
worst
deals with about,
performer
I'd say
in the
about
G7
12,000
nation.
documents. I guess
So
after
why
the
is this?
events that have all
Consider this,
shocked
right
conscience
now,
over the last
we are
4
at the
months,
very bottom of the
it's led us to a
when it
rethinking
comes
of,
to investments
of the
in
position that we
renewable
have as a Canadian government.
We are down there
The
with
belief was that we
Russia
were fulfilling
and
the strict
Saudi
legal
Arabia.
obligations of our duties to the
So
National
without
Center
those
for Truth and
investments, we are
Reconciliation.
never going to
Obviously,
meet our
knowing there's a
targets.
lot of survivors that are
And
looking
this
for
brings us
closure,
to
and
the
any
heart
piece of
the problem
information
that's confronting
can
Canada
provide that.
today. Because as an
We took a look
energy-producing
internally and saw
nation,
readily
we
this
cannot
group
allow
of documents that
ourselves at the back
should be
of the
disclosed
pack
to
when it
the
comes to
NCTR.
investing
And
in
so
clean tech.
go ahead, Glenn.
Over the past 4 years, we've seen major investment firms, insurers, and bondholders announcing that they are pulling out of Canada's energy sector because of the lack of action on climate change. So is this how Prime Minister Trudeau will manage the transition? By a steady bleed off
We're talking
of
about
investment in jobs.
the only reason they were not
It is
being
unconscionable
released
that the government is failing to work with energy workers on transforming our economy to meet the challenges that
I'm not going to
face us, the
presume on set
urgent
that
challenges we need
at the outset that
face
they
right
won't.
now. So what
And
needs to be
indeed,
done?
we've had a
Well,
few
the
indications
RBC
that
has
it
pegged
should be fine.
the price of investments
But I think it's time.
$57
And
billion
this is our duty
a
as a government
year
and moral
in
duty
clear
towards
and targeted
survivors who can
investments. Clean Energy
as a matter of
Canada
closure,
states that the task will require
would
Canada to undertake
need that
a
information, and
massive
it's information
investment
that has been
in
requested
renewable
of us.
energy.
There's no valid
But the
reason.
upside of this massive
Obviously,
spending
all
is that it
governments are
will
concerned
create
with liability, but there's an
200,000
overarching need
jobs,
to think about this
as
from the
compared to the
perspective of
situation
survivors,
now, where we're
and
just
that's why the
watching
decision was
bleed
taken.
off of jobs. We're here this morning as New Democrats to say
About 30 to
we
45
will
days,
stand
David.
up for Canadian workers
They
and the
go
environment
from
and
anything
at
from school
putting in
registries
place a
and
plan
narratives
to
to
address
detailed documentation.
catastrophic climate change.
It's quite a voluminous
We will reach out our hand to the government.
disclosure process, so we
work
said
with
30 to
them,
45
because
days,
the
but
stakes
hopefully
are so high.
quicker, and I know the Christmas
But
period's
to do
coming up,
this,
but
the Prime Minister needs
it
to
should be done relatively
understand
quickly.
that spin will not cut it. We need to work on a serious investment plan with commitments to make this change a reality. Le Premier ministre s'est rendu à la COP26 afin d'annoncer des engagements.
Yeah, and you're not. I'm not going to speak to it publicly right now, David. The talks are ongoing. They are very fluid, very dynamic. I believe positive, but there are some things to iron out. Again, this is a multifaceted process that includes historical compensation as well as achieving long-term reform. So, a lot of moving parts. A lot of people sitting around the table under the stewardship of Maurice Sinclair, and it's something that as long as we're talking, it's possible.
Alors, faut-il faire? Le NPD exige que le gouvernement mette en place un
Well,
plan des investissements
again,
pour le développement
over the last 4 months, we've all had to look inwards and look at ourselves,
s'engager envers
look
les
at
travailleurs
the
du
plight
secteur
of
d'énergie
Indigenous folks that
et
are
à utiliser
reeling,
leurs
some still
compétences
suffering in silence,
pour
those
assurer la
courageously speaking out as
transition
well,
vers une nouvelle
people suffering from
économie
intergenerational trauma.
énergétique. La
It's
réponse
focused
à la crise
the inward, first the inward look,
doit
and
être
the need to
basée
think more
sur la
about
collaboration
closure that
avec
survivors would get, and the moral
travailleurs,
duty of the government of Canada to
travailleuses
disclose
et
these
familles.
documents.
Et
You
c'est
may say that
nécessaire
a
pour
piece
le
of
gouvernement de
information that would
mettre en
seem
place un plan des
pretty
investissements
anodyne to most people
massifs
who
pour le
might not
Canada
provide closure,
qui
but I've
devient
heard enough
un leader
testimonial from
dans la
survivors
lutte
to say,
pour la
for example,
justice
finding out a
climatique.
record of someone
I will
at a
turn it
certain
over
place in
to
time
my
can
colleague
provide a
from
certain
Edmonton.
level of solace and closure for those people. And I can't presume to say that there's anything in there that will be helpful, but I know that it is
Thank you,
information.
Thank you all for being here
shouldn't,
today.
We shouldn't be
My name
sitting
is
on
Heather
simply because
McPherson,
we
and
have
I am
third-party
the Member of
disclosure
Parliament for
obligations
Edmonton
to
Strathcona.
to religious orders that were part and parcel of
what I have been
all the
fighting
damage
for in the House of Commons since I have been elected is a strong future for Alberta. Alberta is facing a dual crisis. And this is a crisis that we have been seeing coming down the road for a very, very long time. And that crisis is a climate crisis, a climate emergency, and also an economic crisis.
And you heard it from the Prime Minister himself in Kamloops. What you heard was clearly the belief that all illegal obligations had been fulfilled in terms of our disclosure to the NCTR. We knew that there was more documentation, and he said he would leave no stone unturned. This is part of the process. This isn't the end of the process. We're going to look internally at the way we invoke certain legal principles, see if they're being too broadly invoked, but that will take a little time alongside the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Indigenous Services, to look at the way we protect documentation with that moral lens, with the view that survivors need that information to move on. This isn't an issue of liability. It's about people trying to get some information and get a sense of what went on. And I think that's more important. There are, as your colleagues have alluded to, real and deep considerations to confidentiality. Some of this information does document very, very painful allegations, occurrences, facts, and it is something that the Supreme Court, in respect of independent assessment process documents, have said benefit from absolute confidentiality. So by no stretch of the imagination, people think this is an easy process. It will be difficult, but it's something we have to look at through the lens of the last 4 months, going over and above our legal obligations.
And that Alberta doesn't get left behind.
We are very, as New Democrats, we are pleased that the government is finally admitting their obligation to turn over documents relating to the crimes committed in the residential schools. It was preposterous for the Prime Minister to challenge the Catholic Church to turn over documents when we knew that the federal government was refusing to turn over key documents to the Truth and Reconciliation. These are documents that are needed for survivors, but also for the historic record. Because what we're talking about is the attempted genocide of Indigenous people. These records will be super important in the coming years. So it's taken a long time for the government to admit that they have to turn over these documents. I'm glad that they're finally putting the interests of history and survivors ahead of the interests of protecting the other collaborators in this attack on Indigenous people, particularly the Catholic Church. We have seen this government say they turned over the documents when we knew it wasn't true. We saw how a St. Anne survivor was told that she needed permission from the Catholic Church in order to even be able to talk about what happened to her. The government has not been willing to turn over any of these documents until we started to see these unmarked graves appearing and the growing pressure. It's been the tradition of the Catholic Church and the federal government working hand in hand, protecting each other's interests. Outstanding on top of these documents are the multitude of documents from the class actions that were being launched up to the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement. There were many, many cases adjudicated. There's evidence. The government knows a lot more than they've turned over, so we're glad these documents are turned over. We're saying all the documents that are within the hands of the Justice Department need to be turned over. The police evidence, the court evidence, the records that they have of the known predators, all that has to be turned over so that we can get a full sense of the crimes and the systemic crimes that were committed against Indigenous children in this country.
Of course we need to be human rights issues. Of course we have to act on the fact that there is a genocide.
The agreements that the federal government has had from the get-go has been with the Catholic Church. They have walked hand in hand on this. They have now recognized that this is not a relationship that has been helpful. We know that there's issues of the Oblates shifting documents to Rome. The idea that the Prime Minister had the gall to call the Catholic Church to turn over documents when they themselves were sitting on thousands of pages of evidence. What's changed? Well, once we started to find the mass number of unmarked graves of dead children, the government realized that they had to start taking this issue more seriously. This is not going to go away. It's not going to be swept under the carpet. This is Canada's historic reckoning. So those third-party agreements with the various church orders, null and void. History is calling for justice.
Explain why it's so important.
We know
in so many communities where children never came home. People are still asking questions. The very first time I ever went into the community of Attawapiskat, I was stopped by family members and said, nobody ever told us what happened to our uncle, what happened to our cousins. The documents are there. We know those documents are there. We need to have the documents turned over. It's not just for the survivors, but for the historic record. Because Canada's role in the attempted genocide of Indigenous people is a historic reckoning. And the only way we're going to move forward as a nation is to have those documents, to know what happened, and to be able to say, this is the true historic record and it will never happen again.
That in and of itself, to me, is problematic. There's huge problems having the Olympics in Beijing.
Nous sommes très inquiets avec la situation à la Chine. C'est une des options que le gouvernement doit considérer. Et il faut protéger tous les droits des personnes.
Mentioning on the quarantine hotels, we're hearing some troubling stories about lack of personal necessities. We're hearing stories about people being forced to wait while they already have their negative test results to get discharged. Why is it so badly organized?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is that we introduced these measures to protect Canadians and over Prime Trudeau. It's a concern. We have to. I was just
certainly the issue of how pandemic spending
we put the measures in place to
protect. It's a vital question for Canadians.
We have to buy ourselves some time.
Something we need answers for. I'm really pleased that the Finance Committee is meeting because the Prime Minister has shown any willingness to have any of the other committee members come forward.
Are effective against
the Deputy Prime Minister needs to send a message that the government understands that we are not of a COVID by any means at all. We are still seeing major uncertainty. I was just speaking with workers who work from home right now who are in the travel agencies, travel business. Travel is being hit. Tourism is facing major hits. Restaurants are hanging by a thread. And we need to remember as well that many businesses have burned through
no, of course not. The expectation
by any further downturns come January, it will have a huge impact. The government has to do the heavy lifting to get people to the other side. I want to hear that Deputy Prime Minister is going to be there for Canadian workers and small business.
That they get access to.
Hi, David Thurton from CBC News. I'm just...
Notre approche pendant la pandémie est de suivre le conseil tout l'avis de fonctionnaires qui travaillent dans le secteur santé publique. Ça, c'est le hallmark de notre approche. Et maintenant, tous les règlements et les mesures qui ont été mises en place sur le terrain à la frontière est nécessaire.
We are an energy producing nation. That is scandalous. That we are at the bottom of the G7 on dealing with our emissions targets. We're saying to the Prime Minister, you don't get to go to Paris and make grand announcements unless you have a clear plan. That clear plan must include workers because it's about making the investments in the new energy
we're not going to spare
we have
any
huge
expense or
potential in
resources
Alberta with
when it comes to
geothermal. We
protecting
could be putting workers on the ground right now. Hydrogen in
Clear
Edmonton,
travel
there's
times.
huge plans underway. Where is the
There's
federal
the travel
government?
times.
So we're saying to the
That's
Prime
difficult.
Minister, we need to be realistic.
Le Canada demeure préoccupé par la situation des droits de l'homme en Chine. On est toujours en discussion avec nos alliés. Puis pour le moment, il n'y a pas encore de décision qui est prise. C'est pas une décision qu'on prendra à la légère. De mon côté, comme ministre des Sports, évidemment, ma préoccupation, c'est nos athlètes et le succès. Donc, dès qu'on aura une décision, on pourra vous la communiquer. On discute avec tous les pays alliés traditionnels du Canada. So far, the decision hasn't been made. We are, of course, very preoccupied with the violations of human rights in China. It's not a decision that we're going to take lightly, and as soon as we have made the decision, we will communicate it to you.
WHO the head of the WHO is very concerned that countries aren't accepting country of origin test results from the Southern African nations. What do you say to that?
What's your response
Look,
to that?
what we've committed to Canadians is to do everything we can to protect their health and safety, and that we have border measures based on the information and the advice that we receive. The reason why we've included this third country testing is to create some kind of a cushion between the time of departure and the time of arrival. And it's based on the advice that we receive. As we learn more about this variant, as we learn more about conditions, we could reassess. But for now, this is the rationale for putting a third country testing.
Some airports say they're worried that the new testing requirement for people coming into the country from abroad, except the United States, is going to create major delays during the holiday travel season. What do you say? Is that going to be the case?
I say I really am sympathetic to the anxiety that people have, that airports have. These measures are meant to protect the health and safety of Canadians. We are working closely with airports and Public Health Agency of Canada and CBSA to do it as smoothly and as efficiently as possible. But I also want to let Canadians know and ask for their patience and cooperation. This is a new system that we're implementing that may take some time to ramp up, but we need to. We're all in this together, and I ask for everybody.
But travelers should expect delays.
Travelers need to be prepared for this. Thanks.
The head of the WHO says he's dismayed that that countries like Canada aren't accepting the original test results from South Africa, from the Southern African countries.
That's a great question.
That Canada just won't accept those. What do you think?
Well, we obviously recognize that this is very complicated for everyone, including people in South Africa who are having a very harsh time. But we're obviously putting this into place not because we like that, but because we have to protect the health and safety of Canadians.
Le manque 10 millions de tests rapides, maintenant, le plus rapidement possible, qu'ils veulent distribuer avant les fêtes, est-ce qu'ils vont les avoir?
Et justement, ça tombe très bien parce que j'en parlais avec le ministre Dubé ce matin, il y a à peu près 2 heures, donc on va travailler là-dessus parce que c'est une demande importante et on sait à quel point les tests rapides pour les Québécois et les autres Canadiens, ça va être important dans les prochaines semaines.
Les avez-vous? Est-ce que vous allez les envoyer? Est-ce qu'il y a une entente?
On s'entend pour travailler là-dessus et il y aura prochainement de bonnes nouvelles, je crois.
Pensez-vous qu'il y a un boycott diplomatique des autres Pékin?
Un boycott de qui?
Un boycott diplomatique des autres Pékin? Des Jeux Olympiques?
Oh, là, vous avez une bonne question. Malheureusement, la mauvaise personne à qui poser la question. Là, je vous encourage à poser la question à mes collègues là, qui sont davantage en charge des relations internationales.
Vous pensez que c'est une bonne idée?
Je crois que la relation évidemment, avec la Chine et les autres pays, c'est une relation fondamentale. Mais pour avoir une réponse qui satisfait vos hautes attentes, je vous encourage à demander à des collègues.
Sur les aéroports, est-ce que vous avez une date précise? À Montréal, en gros, c'est toujours pas en place pour les tests dans les aéroports. Est-ce que vous savez à quel moment ça va l'être? On parle de encore plusieurs jours avant que ce soit.
Et depuis, entre mercredi dernier et vendredi dernier, on avait déjà connu une augmentation de 60% de la capacité de tests à travers le pays. Il y a des différences régionales, évidemment, en compte des situations aéroportuaires locales, mais ça va bien et au cours de la prochaine semaine, les prochains jours, on aura d'autres annonces d'augmentation additionnelle des capacités de testage.
And quickly on the WHO Southern African business, how long will South Africa, Malawi, Mozambique, et cetera, be banned from travel and from their tests and so on? Like, is this weeks? Is this months? Like, you can't go on forever. So what sort of circuit breaker length of time are we talking here?
Well, we obviously understand the concern, and we would like to know the future. However, there is yet a lot of things we don't know about both the variant and the situation across the world. So my GHAC and the relevant health officials are working with the countries affected and with international partners.
Les tests, vous les avez donc, les tests rapides?
Merci, on va en parler plus tard.
Merci.
U.S. travel rules, yeah.
And the last that on the 14 hotels for the stories in Vancouver and in Toronto that people, even when they have gotten their negative tests, are waiting sometimes a day, sometimes longer to get the official discharge notice. They're not going to be properly testing their diapers, proper food, access to clothing, not even get their luggage.
This morning, we know who are the ones who are really serious. We know
well, these are really troubling stories. This is the second time we've had border restrictions, so travel rules in place that require the use of quarantine hotels. So you would think that the government would have contingencies in place place to give people the proper care and concern while they're waiting for their negative tests. So I'm really troubled to hear the stories that we've all heard in the media about people's treatment, and I would hope that the minister would take immediate action to resolve these issues.
To really tackle this important issue about whether it's water safety.
Well, the government needs to provide direction. They need to tell these facilities exactly what's expected, so that the Canadians who are returning home and are staying in these hotels and these quarantine facilities have the proper care that they deserve.
I think what we really have come to understand, seeing what happens on the ground, is that it doesn't matter how many commissions Ottawa establishes, unless there's actually powers to ensure.
Well, the bottom line is that we need to keep Canadians safe. So any rules the government puts in place have to be backed with the best evidence. They should be transparent about what that evidence is. And in the case where we are using quarantine facilities, the Canadians returning home should be offered the full care and concern that they deserve while they're awaiting their native.
There's a huge failure. In terms of the climate crisis, water will be...
Good afternoon. Gord Johns, Member of Parliament for Courtenay, Alberni, and I'm the federal NDP critic for mental health and addictions. I'm here with our deputy leader, Alexander Boularice. Today, we're here calling on the government to take action on the overdose crisis that's happening right across our country. Over 20,000 lives have been lost since 2016, since this Liberal government took power. People, mothers and fathers, and sons and daughters have lost family members. People are grieving right across this country. All we've seen is inaction from this Liberal government. Right now, we know that people are united across this country. Health officials, coast to coast to coast, the Police Chiefs Association, medical experts, Mom Stop the Harm, calling on the government to implement simple steps.
This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.